The notice was taped to my door at 6 in the morning, edges already soaked through from the snow that had fallen overnight. I pulled it off and read the first line: unapproved exterior modification detected, violation fee assessed, compliance required within 24 hours. I stood there in my black parka and gray beanie, breath fogging in the freezing air, staring at the words like they were written in a foreign language. The mat on my steps was a simple black rubber grid I had bought at the hardware store 3 days earlier. It melted snow. That was it. No lights, no sound, no permanent installation. I had plugged it into an outdoor outlet and laid it flat. Now the Cedar Point Owners Association was calling it a modification and demanding I remove it immediately or face escalating penalties. I moved to Vancouver, Washington 6 months earlier because the rent was cheaper than Portland and the commute to my electrical jobs was manageable. I am a licensed electrician, and after a brutal year of medical bills and a truck engine replacement that wiped out my savings, I needed a place where I could rebuild my finances without bleeding money every month. Cedar Point was a townhome complex with shared walls and non-stop complaints. Every week someone was griping about parking, noise, trash cans left out 5 minutes too long, or holiday decorations that violated some unwritten aesthetic standard. The HOA seemed to thrive on petty enforcement. I kept my head down, paid my dues on time, and figured if I stayed quiet, I would be fine. I was wrong. The mat had been working perfectly. The steps stayed clear. No ice buildup. No slip hazard. I thought I was being responsible. Apparently, responsibility was not the point. The notice listed a violation code I had never heard of, and a fine schedule that started at $50 and doubled every week. At the bottom, in neat block letters, was a signature. Maureen Kim, Social Committee Chair. I knew Maureen. Everyone called her Sharon behind her back because she had that exact energy. Blonde hair pulled into a bun, purple belted wool coat she wore like armor, red knit hat perched on top like a crown. She ran the social committee but acted like she ran the entire complex. She organized the holiday potlucks nobody wanted to attend and sent passive-aggressive emails about noise complaints that were never specific enough to refute. Now she was coming after my mat. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the notice, then another of the mat itself. The edges were dry. The snow around it had melted into a neat border. There was no damage to the concrete, no electrical hazard, nothing. I opened the HOA covenant documents I had saved when I moved in and searched for anything about exterior modifications. The section I found was vague, written in lawyer speak about permanent alterations requiring board approval. A mat was not permanent. I could pick it up and move it in 10 seconds. I drafted a polite email to the management company explaining that and asking them to reverse the fine. I hit send and went to work, thinking that would be the end of it. That evening Sharon showed up at my door with a clipboard and a smirk. She did not wait for me to invite her in. She just started talking, her voice sharp and clipped. She told me the mat was a trip hazard because it was not flush with the step surface. She told me the electrical cord violated fire code because it crossed a walkway. She told me the HOA had received multiple complaints from neighbors who felt it was an eyesore. I asked her which neighbors. She said she was not at liberty to disclose that information. I asked her to show me the specific rule I was violating. She flipped through her clipboard, pulled out a single-page printout with highlighted sections, and jabbed her finger at a paragraph about landscaping and common area boundaries. I read it twice. It said nothing about mats or electrical devices. I pointed that out. She sighed like I was wasting her time and said the board had interpreted the rule to include any item placed on steps leading to a unit entrance because those steps were technically common area property. I felt my chest tighten. The steps were attached to my unit. They led to my door. Nobody else used them. I told her that. She said it did not matter. The HOA owned the exterior structure, and anything I placed there required approval. I asked if she had approved the wreaths on half the doors in the complex. She said wreaths were decorative and temporary. I said the mat was temporary too. She said it was functional, which made it different. I could feel the conversation looping. She was not going to budge. She looked at me with that tight little smile and said, "I am just doing my job, do not blame me." Then she handed me a second notice, this one printed on HOA letterhead, stating that if the mat was not removed by 8 the next morning, The HOA would deny my access to amenities like the pool and gym until compliance was achieved. I did not use the pool or the gym, but the threat was clear. This was just the beginning. I closed the door and stood there for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. I had dealt with unreasonable clients before, people who wanted electrical work done for half the cost and twice the speed. But this was different. Sharon was not a client. She was a neighbor with a clipboard and a grudge I had not earned. I looked at the mat. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The steps were clear. The snow was melting. The alternative was letting ice build up and risking a fall every time I came home after dark. I had already slipped twice on untreated steps at other units in the complex. Nobody else seemed to care. Now I was being punished for caring. I spent the next hour digging through the HOA documents again, this time printing out every page and highlighting anything relevant. I found the covenant section on common areas. It defined them as walkways, parking lots, mailbox clusters, and landscaped green spaces. It did not mention unit steps. I found the rules about modifications. They covered fences, sheds, exterior paint, and permanent fixtures. They did not cover temporary items. I also found a clause about safety, stating that homeowners were responsible for maintaining safe access to their units during winter weather. The mat was safety equipment. It should have been encouraged, not fined. I took screenshots of everything and saved them to a folder on my phone. I had a feeling I was going to need them. The next morning I woke up to another notice, this one tucked under my windshield wiper. The paper was damp and half frozen, the ink smeared but still readable. It claimed I had damaged common area concrete with salt and demanded reimbursement for resurfacing costs. I had not used salt. The mat melted snow with heat. There was no salt anywhere near my steps. I took a picture of the notice and another of the steps, zooming in on the concrete. It looked exactly the same as it had the day I moved in, a little weathered but no cracks, no discoloration, no damage. Sharon was making things up now, throwing accusations at the wall to see what would stick. I felt my anger rising, but I forced it down. Getting emotional would not help. I needed to stay calm and document everything. I drove to the HOA management company office that afternoon, a small suite in a strip mall off Highway 14. The woman at the front desk looked bored. I explained the situation, showed her the notices, and asked to speak to someone who could review the fines. She told me the property manager for Cedar Pointe was out of town and would not be back until the following week. I asked if there was anyone else. She said I could email my concerns and they would be forwarded. I said I had already emailed. She shrugged. I asked for a copy of the official complaint log. She said that was internal information and not available to residents. I thanked her and left, feeling like I had just run into a brick wall. That night I got another email from Sharon. Subject line, final warning. The body was 2 sentences. The mat must be removed by 8 tomorrow morning or the association will begin daily fines of $100 per day starting at 9. She copied the entire board in the management company. I read it 3 times trying to figure out if she was serious. $100 a day was insane. That was $3,000 a month for a rubber mat that was not hurting anyone. I could not afford that. I was barely keeping up with my bills as it was. The truck repairs had cleaned out my emergency fund, and I was still paying off the last of the medical debt. I needed this situation to end before it spiraled into something that would wreck me financially. I called my buddy Eric, who worked as a community manager for a different HOA across town. He had been in the business for years and had seen every flavor of neighborhood insanity. I explained the whole thing, the mat, the fines, the salt accusation, the 24-hour deadlines. He listened without interrupting. Then he laughed. Not a mean laugh, just a tired one. He told me Sharon was running a classic intimidation play. She was betting I would fold under pressure and remove the mat just to make the problem go away. He said most people did exactly that, and that was why HOAs kept getting away with garbage like this. He told me to check the covenant definitions again, specifically the part about common area boundaries. If my steps were not listed as common area, the whole case fell apart. He also told me to look at the fine schedule in the official rules. If daily fines were not listed there, Sharon was making them up. I hung up and opened the documents again. Eric was right. The common area section listed walkways, parking lots, mailbox clusters, and green spaces. Unit steps were not mentioned. I found the fine schedule buried in an appendix. It listed violations for noise, parking, trash, and landscaping. There was nothing about exterior modifications and nothing about daily compounding fines. The maximum fine listed for any violation was $250, assessed once, with a hearing process before collection. Sharon was inventing penalties that did not exist in the rules. I took screenshots of both pages and added them to my evidence folder. I stayed calm, because I had one piece of proof that would end the whole game. I just was not ready to play it yet. I drafted another email to the management company, this time attaching the screenshots and citing the specific rule sections. I kept the tone polite but firm. I pointed out that the steps were not common area, that the mat was temporary safety equipment, and that the proposed fines exceeded the limits in the published schedule. I asked for a formal review and a written response. I sent it at 11 that night and set an alarm for 7 the next morning. I was not removing the mat. If Sharon wanted a fight, she was going to get one, but it was going to be fought with facts and documents, not shouting matches on my porch. The alarm went off and I checked my email. Nothing from the management company. Nothing from the board. Just another message from Sharon, sent at 6:15, repeating the demand and adding a new claim. She said the mat was causing water runoff that was freezing on the sidewalk below my steps and creating a hazard for other residents. I looked out the window. There was no sidewalk below my steps. The steps led to a small concrete pad that connected to the driveway. The nearest sidewalk was 20 feet away and separated by a snowbank. She was lying again, and she was doing it in writing. I saved the email. At 8:30, Sharon showed up again, this time with 2 other people I did not recognize. One was an older man in a green puffer jacket, the other a woman in her 40s wearing a dark coat and carrying a tablet. Sharon introduced them as board members. She did not give names. She pointed at the mat and said it was still there. I said I was waiting for a written response from the management company. She said the board had the authority to act immediately in cases of safety violations. I asked what the safety violation was. She said the mat. I asked her to be specific. She said it was creating a slip hazard. I pointed at the clear, dry steps and the icy, snow-covered steps on the unit next door. I asked which one looked more hazardous. The older man shifted his weight and looked uncomfortable. The woman with the tablet did not say anything. Sharon ignored the question and said the board had voted to deny my amenity access effective immediately, and that if the mat was not removed by end of business today, they would proceed to the next step. I asked what the next step was. She smiled and said an attorney letter. I asked if she had consulted an attorney yet. She said the association kept one on retainer. I said I would be happy to speak with them directly. She said that would not be necessary and that I should just comply. Then she said it again, that line I would hear twice more before this was over. I am just doing my job, do not blame me. She turned and walked back to a silver SUV parked at the curb. The other 2 followed. I watched them drive away and felt something shift in my chest. This was not about the mat anymore. This was about control. Sharon wanted to prove she could make me do what she wanted, and she was going to keep escalating until I either broke or fought back hard enough to make it not worth her time. I went inside and called Eric again. I told him about the attorney letter threat and the amenity denial. He asked if I had received anything in writing from the board about the vote. I said no. He told me to request it immediately, in writing, with the date and the names of the board members who voted. He said if they could not produce that, the vote never happened, and the denial was not enforceable. He also told me to check if the HOA was actually paying for an attorney or if Sharon was bluffing. Most small HOAs did not keep lawyers on retainer. They hired them on a case-by-case basis, and that took time and board approval. He said to call her bluff and see what happened. I sent another email to the management company and copied Sharon and the entire board. I requested a copy of the board vote authorizing the amenity denial and the attorney engagement. I cited the section of the covenant that required written notice of any enforcement action. I kept it short and factual. Then I waited. An hour later, I got a reply from Sharon. She said the vote had been conducted via emergency email ballot and that the results were confidential. She said the attorney had been briefed and would be sending a letter within 48 hours. She did not answer the question about written notice. I forwarded the email to Eric. He replied with one word: bluff. The next day was Saturday. I spent the morning working a service call, rewiring a panel in a house out in Camas. The homeowner was friendly, paid cash, and did not care about HOA drama. It was a relief to focus on something straightforward. When I got home that afternoon, there was a new notice taped to my door. This one was different. It was printed on heavy cardstock with the Cedar Point logo at the top and a red border around the text. It stated that the association had engaged legal counsel and that further non-compliance would result in a lien being placed on my property. It listed the total fines accumulated so far, $250. It gave me 72 hours to pay and remove the mat or face additional legal action. At the bottom, in smaller print, it said the association reserved the right to pursue all remedies available under Washington state law. I took a picture and added it to the folder. I texted Eric a photo of the new notice. He called me back within 5 minutes. He told me the lien threat was real, but only if the fines were valid, which they were not. He said Washington state HOA law required a hearing process before a lien could be filed, and that the hearing had to be scheduled in writing with at least 14 days' notice. He told me to demand a hearing immediately and to refuse to pay anything until the hearing happened. He also told me to start looking at the HOA ledger if I could get access to it. He said a lot of times these small-time enforcers were sloppy with their bookkeeping and you could find fees that did not match the rules. He said if I could prove the fees were bogus, the whole case would collapse. I did not have access to the ledger, but I knew someone who might. My neighbor 2 units down, a guy named Paul, had served on the board the year before and quit after Sharon pushed through a special assessment for landscaping that nobody wanted. He told me at the time that the board meetings were a circus and that Sharon ran them like a dictatorship. I knocked on his door that evening. He opened it holding a beer and wearing a Seahawks sweatshirt. I explained the situation. He laughed and said Sharon had tried the same thing with him over a holiday light timer. He had fought it and won, but only because he had kept every email and recorded a board meeting where Sharon contradicted herself. He told me to do the same. He also told me he still had access to the HOA shared drive from his board tenure and that Sharon had never bothered to revoke it. He said he could pull the ledger and the meeting minutes if I wanted. I said yes. Paul sent me the files that night. The ledger was a mess. There were line items for violations that had no corresponding rule citations. There were fees assessed without hearing dates. There were entries labeled miscellaneous that had no explanation. I found my name in the December column with a $50 charge listed as exterior modification, but the date was wrong. It was listed as December 10th, 2 days before I had even bought the mat. I highlighted the line and took a screenshot. That was my smoking gun. Sharon had backdated the fine to make it look like she had been tracking the violation longer than she actually had. It was sloppy, lazy, and completely provable. I called Eric again and walked him through the ledger. He told me to save everything and to file a formal dispute with the management company. He said to cite the backdated fine, the missing hearing, and the lack of rule support. He also told me to mention that I was considering filing a complaint with the Washington State Attorney General's office if the HOA did not reverse the fines and stop the harassment. He said the word harassment was key. It put the management company on notice that this could turn into a liability issue, and management companies hated liability. I drafted the email that night. I kept it professional but direct. I attached the ledger screenshot, the covenant excerpts, and the timeline of notices. I stated that the fines were invalid, that the process had not been followed, and that I was requesting an immediate reversal and a formal apology. I said I was prepared to escalate the matter if necessary. I hit send at 10 and went to bed knowing Monday was going to be ugly. Monday morning I got a call from a number I did not recognize. It was the regional supervisor for the management company, a woman named Angela who sounded tired and annoyed. She said she had received my email and reviewed the file. She said the fines were being held pending a board hearing, which would be scheduled within 30 days. She said the amenity denial was being lifted immediately. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge the backdated fine or the missing rule citations. She just said the process was being corrected and that I would receive written confirmation by end of week. I asked if the mat could stay in place during the review. She paused. then said the board had not issued a formal removal order, so technically yes. I thanked her and hung up. It felt like a small win, but I knew Sharon was not going to let it go. She proved me right 2 days later. I came home from a job site and found a stack of door hangers on my steps, the paper edges soaked and curling from the snow that had fallen that afternoon. Each one had the Cedar Pointy logo and a printed message: notice of violation, unapproved exterior item, compliance required. There were 6 of them, all identical, all dated that day. It was overkill, a deliberate attempt to make me feel harassed and overwhelmed. I gathered them up and took pictures of each one, then added them to my evidence folder. The door hangers became a running gag. Every time it snowed, I would find more of them, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, always wet, always the same message. I started keeping count. By the end of the month, I had collected 19. The hearing notice finally arrived in mid-January, a certified letter requiring a signature. It scheduled the hearing for February 2nd at 7 in the evening in the clubhouse. It listed the charges: unapproved exterior modification, damage to common property, and failure to comply with board directives. It said I had the right to present evidence and speak on my own behalf. It also said the board would make a final determination that night and that the decision would be binding. I signed for the letter and started preparing. I printed out every email, every notice, every screenshot. I organized them into a binder with tabs. I wrote a timeline on a single sheet of paper listing every interaction with Sharon and every bogus claim she had made. I practiced my presentation in front of the mirror, keeping it calm and factual. I was not going to let emotion wreck this. Eric agreed to come with me as a witness. He had no formal role, but his presence would signal that I was not just some random homeowner who could be pushed around. He knew the rules, he knew the process, and he knew how to spot procedural violations. I also reached out to Paul and asked if he would attend. He said he would, and he said he had something to show me but wanted to wait until the hearing to drop it. I did not push. I trusted him. The week before the hearing, Sharon ramped up again. I got a call from a towing company saying they had been contracted by Cedar Point to remove a vehicle parked in violation of guest parking rules. I told them I did not have a vehicle in guest parking. They said the work order listed my unit number. I asked for a copy of the work order. They said they could not provide that, but that the HOA had authorized the tow. I told them if they towed my truck from my assigned spot, I would file a police report for theft. They put me on hold, then came back and said there had been a mistake and the work order was canceled. I asked who had submitted the order. They would not say. I knew it was Sharon. I called the management company and reported it. Angela sounded even more tired than before. She said she would look into it. I said this was the 3rd time Sharon had made a false claim and that it was starting to feel like targeted harassment. I said I was documenting everything and that if it continued I would be filing a formal complaint not just with the board but with the state. Angela said she understood and that she would speak to Sharon. I said I appreciated that, but I did not believe it would make a difference. I was right. 2 days later I got another door hanger, this one claiming my outdoor outlet was not up to code and that I needed to hire a licensed electrician to inspect it. I am a licensed electrician. The outlet was code compliant. I had installed it myself. Sharon was not even trying to make sense anymore. She was just throwing everything at me to see what would break me. The day before the hearing, I ran into another neighbor at the mailbox cluster. Her name was Lisa, and she lived 3 units down. She had always been friendly but distant, the kind of neighbor who waved but did not stop to chat. This time, she stopped. She asked if I was the one fighting with Sharon about the mat. I said yes. She looked around like she was checking for witnesses. Then she told me Sharon had been on her property twice in the last month. Once to take pictures of her trash cans, and once to measure the height of a fence panel Lisa had replaced. Lisa said she had not given permission either time, and that she had caught Sharon on her doorbell camera. She said Sharon had done the same thing to at least 2 other residents. She said nobody wanted to speak up because Sharon had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who crossed her, but Lisa was done being quiet. She said if I needed a witness or a statement, she would provide it. I felt the ground shift under me. This was not just about me. Sharon had been trespassing on multiple properties, taking pictures, gathering ammunition for future violations. It was a pattern. I asked Lisa if she would be willing to come to the hearing. She hesitated, then said yes. I asked if she still had the doorbell footage. She said she did. I asked her to bring it. She nodded and walked back to her unit. I stood there in the cold watching the snow fall and realized I had just been handed the twist I needed. Sharon was not just a bully. She was a documented trespasser, and now I had proof that it was not personal. It was systematic. The hearing was set for 7. I arrived at 6:45 with Eric and Paul. The clubhouse was a small one-story building near the front entrance, with a community room that held about 30 people. There were folding chairs set up in rows and a table at the front with 5 chairs behind it. Sharon was already there, sitting in the center chair, flanked by the older man from before and 3 other board members I had never seen. The woman with the tablet was sitting off to the side, typing. There were maybe a dozen other residents scattered in the audience, most of them looking like they had been dragged there against their will. Lisa was sitting in the back row. She gave me a small nod. Sharon called the meeting to order at 7 exactly. She read the charges, her voice flat and bureaucratic. Unapproved exterior modification. Damage to common property. Failure to comply with board directives. She said the board had reviewed the evidence and that I would have 10 minutes to present my defense. Then the board would deliberate and issue a ruling. She looked at me and said I could begin whenever I was ready. I stood up, walked to the front, and set my binder on the table. I opened it to the first tab and started talking. I went through the timeline step by step. I showed the covenant sections that defined common area and pointed out that unit steps were not included. I showed the fine schedule and highlighted that daily compounding fines were not authorized. I showed the backdated ledger entry and explained that the charge had been applied before I even owned the mat. I kept my voice calm and steady. I did not accuse Sharon of lying. I just presented the facts and let them speak for themselves. The older board member leaned forward and asked to see the ledger screenshot. I handed him my phone. He studied it for a long moment, then looked at Sharon. She said the date was a clerical error and that it did not change the fact that the mat was still a violation. I asked her which rule it violated. She said the landscaping rule. I asked her to read the rule out loud. She did not. Eric stood up and introduced himself. He said he was a community manager for another HOA and that he was attending as an observer and a resource. He said he had reviewed the Cedar Point covenants and that in his professional opinion, the mat did not meet the definition of a modification under Washington state law or the association's governing documents. He said the process that had been followed was procedurally flawed and that the fines were not enforceable. Sharon cut him off and said outside parties were not permitted to speak at board hearings. Eric said he was not speaking as a party, he was speaking as a witness to the facts. The older board member said he wanted to hear what Eric had to say. Sharon glared at him but did not object further. Eric continued. He pointed out that the amenity denial had been issued without a written vote, that the attorney letter had never been sent, and that the lien threat was premature. He said the association was exposing itself to liability by pursuing unsubstantiated claims. Sharon said the board had the authority to interpret the rules as it saw fit. Eric said interpretation did not override state law. Then Lisa stood up. She said she had something to add. Sharon looked confused. Lisa pulled out her phone and said she had doorbell footage of Sharon entering her property without permission on 2 separate occasions. She said Sharon had been on her driveway taking pictures of her trash cans and measuring her fence. She said she had not filed a complaint because she did not think it would matter, but now she realized it was part of a pattern. She said Sharon had been doing the same thing to other residents and using the information to generate violations. The room went quiet. One of the other board members, a younger guy in a fleece jacket, asked Lisa if she was sure it was Sharon in the footage. Lisa said yes, and she said she could show them right now. Sharon stood up and said the cameras meant nothing, you cannot use them. Lisa looked at her and said the cameras were on her own property recording her own driveway, and that Sharon had no reasonable expectation of privacy when she was trespassing. The older board member asked to see the footage. Lisa pulled it up on her phone and held it out. The board members leaned in. I could not see the screen from where I was standing, but I saw their faces change. Sharon said the footage was out of context and that she had been conducting routine inspections. The younger board member asked if routine inspections included entering private driveways without notice or permission. Sharon did not answer. Paul stood up next. He said he had been on the board the previous year and that Sharon had pushed through multiple enforcement actions without proper votes or documentation. He said he had quit because he could not be part of a process that ignored its own rules. He said the current board needed to look at the pattern, not just this one case. Sharon told him to sit down. He did not. The room was starting to fracture. 2 more residents stood up and said they had received violation notices from Sharon that did not match any actual rule. One of them said Sharon had threatened to report him to code enforcement for a fence stain color. Another said Sharon had tried to fine her for parking a work van in her own driveway. The younger board member looked at Sharon and asked if she had been issuing notices without board approval. Sharon said she had the authority as social committee chair to identify violations and forward them to the board. He said that was not what the bylaws said. He pulled out his own phone and started reading. Sharon cut him off and said the meeting was not about her, it was about my mat. The older board member said actually it was starting to look like the meeting was about a lot more than a mat. I could feel the momentum shifting. Sharon was losing control. I stayed quiet and let it happen. Eric leaned over and whispered that I should ask for a formal vote to dismiss the fines and issue a written finding that the mat was compliant. I stood up and made the request. The older board member said that was reasonable. Sharon said the board needed time to deliberate. The younger board member said they had deliberated enough and that the facts were clear. He said the fines were baseless, the process was flawed, and the association needed to reverse course before someone filed a lawsuit. He moved to dismiss the fines and clear my record. Another board member seconded. Sharon called for a vote. 3 hands went up in favor. Sharon and 1 other member voted no. The motion passed. Sharon looked like she had been slapped. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Sharon did not show up at the next board meeting. She sent an email instead, resigning from the social committee effective immediately. The email was short and bitter. It said the board had failed to support her efforts to maintain community standards and that she could no longer serve in good conscience. It did not mention the trespassing allegations or the backdated fines. It did not apologize. It just blamed everyone else and walked away. I forwarded the email to Angela at the management company and asked if the resignation meant the harassment would stop. She said she hoped so, but that the association was reviewing its procedures and that changes were coming. The changes came faster than I expected. A week later, I got a letter from the HOA insurance carrier. It was addressed to all residents and it explained that the carrier had received a formal complaint regarding harassment claims and potential liability exposure. The letter said the carrier had conducted a review and identified several procedural gaps that needed to be corrected immediately. It listed them. Violation notices required board approval before issuance. Fines required a hearing process with written notice. Common area boundaries needed to be clearly defined and published, and board members were prohibited from entering private property without permission or emergency cause. The letter said the association had 90 days to implement the changes, or the carrier would non-renew the policy. It was signed by a regional claims supervisor. I read it twice and realized what had happened. Angela had not just filed my complaint internally. She had escalated it to the insurance carrier, and the carrier had forced the reforms. I called Eric and told him. He laughed and said insurance carriers did not mess around. He said once liability became a factor, the whole game changed. The carrier did not care about neighborhood drama or petty enforcement. They cared about risk, and an HOA that allowed board members to trespass and issue bogus fines was a massive risk. He said the policy non-renewal threat was the nuclear option, and it had worked. I asked him what would happen to Sharon. He said probably nothing official, but her credibility was destroyed, and the new procedures would make it impossible for her to pull the same tricks again. He said that was as close to justice as you got in HOA world. The mat stayed on my steps through the rest of winter. Nobody said a word about it. Sharon moved out of the complex in March. I heard from Paul that she bought a condo in a building with no HOA. I also heard she tried to get elected to the condo board within a month of moving in. Some people never learn. The reforms took effect in April. The new violation process required written complaints with photo evidence, a board review meeting, and a 14-day notice period before any fine could be assessed. Fines were capped at the amounts listed in the original covenant, and any deviation required a homeowner vote. Board members were banned from entering private property without written permission or a documented emergency. The insurance carrier sent an auditor to verify compliance. Angela told me privately that the audit had found 6 other cases where Sharon had issued fines without proper authority. The carrier had forced the association to reverse all of them and issue refunds. I got a check for $250 and a letter of apology signed by the entire board. Sharon's name was not on it. I kept the stack of door hangers in a box in my closet. 19 soggy, curled pieces of paper with the Cedar Point logo and the same printed threat. Every time I see them, I remember how close I came to caving, pulling the mat, and letting Sharon win just to make the noise stop. I remember the nights I sat at my kitchen table, broke and exhausted, wondering if fighting was worth it. I remember the moment Lisa stood up in that meeting and showed the trespassing footage, and the moment the vote went 3-2, and the moment I realized the insurance letter was going to force real change. I remember all of it, and I remember the one thing I held back until I absolutely needed it. The trump card was not the ledger or the doorbell footage. It was the HOA insurance document I had found buried in the shared drive Paul gave me access to. The document showed that the association's liability coverage had a harassment exclusion clause. If the carrier determined that board members were engaging in targeted harassment, the coverage would be voided and the association would be personally liable for any damages. I did not tell anyone about it during the hearing. I did not need to. I had shown it to Angela 2 days before in a private meeting at the management company office, and I had walked her through every piece of evidence I had collected. I told her the pattern was clear, the procedural violations were documented, and the trespassing was on video. I told her that if the board did not reverse the fines and stop the harassment, I would file a formal claim with the carrier and let them decide if Cedar Point was too much of a risk to insure. Angela had gone pale. She said she would handle it. She did. I never told Sharon what I had. I never needed to. The insurance carrier did the work for me. The reforms were not a favor. They were a survival move. The association could not function without insurance, and the carrier had made it clear that the old way of doing things was over. Sharon could have stayed and adapted, but she chose to leave instead. I think she knew that once the trespassing pattern came out, her position was indefensible. The cameras meant nothing, she had said. You cannot use them. But Lisa did use them, and they mattered more than Sharon ever expected. The final showdown happened on my front porch 3 weeks after the hearing. Sharon showed up unannounced with a surprise inspection crew, 2 guys in reflective vests carrying clipboards and a camera. She said the board had authorized a property compliance check and that they needed to photograph my steps and outlet for the record. I asked to see the authorization in writing. She said it was verbal. I said verbal authorizations were not valid under the new procedures. She said the new procedures did not apply to inspections. I pulled out my phone and opened the insurance carrier letter. I read the section about property access out loud, the part that said board members and contractors were prohibited from entering private property without written permission or documented emergency cause. I asked her if she had written permission. She said she did not need it because this was common area. I pointed at the covenant map on my phone, the one that clearly marked unit steps as homeowner responsibility, not common area. She stared at the screen, her face going red. One of the guys in the reflective vest asked if they should proceed. I said no, they should leave, and if they did not, I would call the police and report trespassing. Sharon said I was being ridiculous. I said I was being accurate. She turned and walked away. The inspection crew followed. I never saw her again. Paul told me later that Sharon had tried to get the insurance letter sealed from public view, claiming it contained confidential business information. The board had voted her down unanimously. The letter stayed public. Residents started asking questions. The board started answering them. A new social committee chair was elected, someone who actually wanted to organize events instead of police the neighborhood. The culture shifted. It was not perfect, but it was better. The door hangers stopped. The bogus fines stopped. The surprise inspections stopped. I kept the mat on my steps through February and into March. and when the snow finally melted for good, I rolled it up and put it in the garage. I did not need it anymore, but I kept it anyway. A reminder that sometimes the fight is worth it even when you are broke and tired and the other side has all the official power. The stakes were real. I was rebuilding my finances after a bad year, and I could not absorb bogus fees that would compound into thousands of dollars. Every notice Sharon sent was another threat to that fragile recovery. Every lie she told was another obstacle I had to spend time and energy fighting instead of working and earning. She knew that. She was counting on it. She thought I would fold because the cost of fighting was higher than the cost of giving in. She was wrong. The cost of giving in was my self-respect and my ability to live in my own home without looking over my shoulder every time I did something as basic as keeping my steps clear. I could not afford to lose that. The ledger was the key. The backdated fine was the crack in the armor. Once I had that screenshot, everything else fell into place. The trespassing footage confirmed the pattern. The insurance document confirmed the stakes. The hearing forced the board to choose between protecting Sharon and protecting the association. They chose the association, and Sharon walked. The outcome was not dramatic. There was no courtroom scene, no sheriff showing up, no public apology. Just a quiet policy change, a letter from an insurance carrier, and a resignation email that blamed everyone but the person who had caused the problem. That was fine. I did not need drama. I needed the harassment to stop. And it did. I still live at Cedar Point. The new board is not perfect, but they follow the rules and they do not make things up. The violations are real now, and the process is transparent. I see Lisa at the mailbox cluster sometimes and we talk about normal things, weather and work and weekend plans. She never mentions the hearing, but I know she remembers. Paul moved out last fall, took a job in Seattle and bought a house with no HOA. He sent me a housewarming photo. No shared walls, no covenants, no board meetings. Just a front yard and a driveway and the freedom to do whatever he wanted. I was happy for him. I learned something from the whole mess. HOAs are not inherently bad. They are just systems, and systems reflect the people who run them. When you get someone like Sharon in charge, someone who treats enforcement like a personal crusade and ignores the rules they are supposed to uphold, the system breaks. It becomes a weapon instead of a tool. The only way to fix it is to hold the system accountable, to demand transparency, to document everything, and to refuse to back down when you are right. It is exhausting. It is stressful. It is worth it. The mat is still in my garage. I have not needed it this year. The winter has been mild, barely any snow, just rain and cold and the occasional freeze. But if we get another hard winter, if the steps ice over and the risk comes back, I will pull that mat out and plug it in without hesitation. And if Sharon ever comes back, or if someone else like her shows up with a clipboard and a smirk and a threat they cannot back up, I will be ready. I have the evidence. I have the allies. I have the proof that the cameras mean something, that the rules matter, and that you cannot win a fight with lies when the other side is armed with facts. Sharon learned that the hard way. I hope it sticks.